Hello, everyone. Welcome to a little Spider-Man 2 spoilercast that we thought we would do. We'd put together now that Jamie and I have finished, completed, and platinumed Spider-Man 2. It's been a while since we've managed to do one of these. Usually it's my fault because I don't finish enough games, or we're on slightly different, not even time frames. Time frames is probably the right word, I suppose. But we've actually finished a game within 2 weeks of each other, I think, which is pretty darn good going.
Yeah, within 2 weeks of each other and within a handful of weeks of the game actually even coming out. So not only are we in that unique window where you and I are both still interested in talking about something, but it's even that window where some people are still interested in hearing about it. So the best of both worlds.
Are you trying to say that if I suggest some Patreon content about Marvel's, the game, that you're not going to want to do it with me, Marvel's Avengers? You're going to be like, Jonesy, nobody wants to see that.
The fucked up thing is, I would tell you that would be my opinion, but there are absolutely going to be people on the Discord who would like to see some Marvel's Avengers content in the year of Ollie.
I don't believe that at all. I think everyone is so over Marvel's Avengers.
There are some sick fucks out there. Never put it past anyone to want to see more Marvel's Avengers.
Fair. But no, anyway, enough Marvel's Avengers. Let's talk about something else Marvel, of course, Spider-Man 2. So you could probably tell by the name, this is a spoiler cast. We're going to spoil the entire game. We are going to talk about absolutely everything that we want to talk about. Nothing's going to be held back. So if you do not want to get Spider-Man 2 spoiled for you, or if you've got a little bit left to go in the game, then please don't watch anymore, because I'm not going to say that like it's going to be 20 minutes before we get into it. We're going to spoil shit straight away. So yeah, you have been warned.
Pretty much.
Absolutely. I think let's jump off with let's talk about I think for me a good place to jump in is going to be how did you find Spider-Man 2 as a game, in the sense of that it grew from the first one and from Miles Morales for you? Let's start with that, the top level stuff.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up how it grew from Spider-Man and Spider-Man Miles Morales, because I think it didn't actually really grow from Spider-Man Miles Morales at all. Like, Miles, I think, has still had a lot of building blocks towards the person that he is in Spider-Man 2. He had to go through everything that's in Miles Morales to be the man and the Spider-Man that he is. But at the same time, like, when I was sort of, hopping around Wikipedia, reminding myself of like which villains we might need to discuss or any story beats that I needed to refresh myself on, I was reminded of names like the Tinkerer and Simon Krieger, who are, the primary antagonists of Spider-Man Miles Morales, and don't factor into any real part of Spider-Man 2 whatsoever. Not that they needed to, but I think it's telling that the most significant part of the previous games, in terms of the things that are hanging over Miles, it's Martin Lee,
Yes.
which all stems from the very first game and stems from even pre-Spider-Man Miles. Which isn't to say that Miles Morales is redundant, but I thought that was interesting. And I also thought that to jump on that exact note, that what was interesting to me was that, in spite of the fact that Peter has I think a stronger start to life in Spider-Man 2, because some of the hooks that it's able to get in with Harry especially, and their friendship, the way it builds on that through flashbacks and Harry's desire to harness the early abilities of the symbiote to help Peter, I think it was telling that by 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through, as Miles's further interactions with Martin Lee began to populate the story, that like Miles grew back to be on the same level and maybe even overtook Peter in some respects. But then I was already a Miles sucker, because I already liked Miles Morales a hell of a lot as a game.
I'd agree with you. I found myself leaning toward Miles in a lot of like the story beats. I think Peter Parker's story has much more of a, I suppose, standard linear kind of Spider-Man comic book fare. From what I don't read the comic books, but that's from whenever you see the films and everything, it's very much Peter has, it's Peter, Mary, Aunt May's dead, Mary Jane is gonna, he wants her to move in with him. It's Peter and Mary Jane, and it's Peter being short of money. It's this very typical Peter Parker story beats that we've heard and seen many times before. Which was fine, and I liked it, but I think when you have Miles, it almost feels a lot fresher.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Maybe that's just
And
me.
also,
I don't know as much about Miles, I suppose, part of it.
well, I don't think that's just you. I think that's going to be most people, even with the prevalence of like the Spider-Verse films. I think there's still something unique to Miles's presence in this story. And the other thing about Peter and that slightly familiar, let's call it Spider-Man 3-esque arc that he has going on, is that they have to pull off the very difficult challenge, and a challenge that a lot of people said Sony Santa Monica failed dramatically with God of War in 2018, which is how can you make one of your characters an absolute dick for an entire chapter of this game without having everyone hate them? And like, I never quite hated Peter because I knew he was going to snap out of it, and obviously you could blame it all on the symbiote. But there were definitely points where symbiote Peter was like, I was like, okay, come on, dude. Like, I was almost relieved when he became Spider-Man again. Do you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Let's roll it back a little bit, because just if there are some people that out there who maybe don't play PlayStation games, who won't play this for a while and who happily listen to this, but just to flesh it out a little bit more, let's roll it back to something you mentioned, to the beginning of the symbiote arc. Because so one of the things that I really liked and felt, but it's strangely moving and like touching given how sort of simple it was. But when Harry first comes back on the scene and you go through a bike ride through your old neighborhood and you end up at the school, like I loved that. That was such a great way to kind of introduce an old new character and give you the feels and be like, no, because they had a short amount of time to really build like a bond and a friendship. And I thought they did a fantastic job.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially because, again, Harry, in terms of the way his personality or his representation in the game could go, is quite a difficult character to balance, because there's a lot of Harry's attributes that kind of lean into the sort of snarky, rich kid, the world at my feet and it's all thanks to my dad kind of vibe that he definitely flirts with at times. But at the same time, they've got to make him likable, and they've got to have you believe that Peter Parker, the nicest human on planet Earth, would also be best friends with this dude. And they do get there eventually. And I actually think, interestingly, while the symbiote is famous for the more negative or out of character reactions that it prompts from the people it bonds with or binds with, I thought that when Harry was in the early stages of utilizing the symbiote and trying to help Peter, that was almost when he was at his most fun and his most endearing.
I agree. Like, and I didn't expect it either. Like, to have him as part of the team and for those two to sort of team up and become. Yeah. I think they went maybe they went slightly too hard of how powerful Harry was. Like, so because then you couldn't juxtapose it against how powerful Black Suit Spider-Man was, because they didn't feel. I don't know. I think I wanted a little bit more of a gulf. Like a superhero with the symbiote, to me, should have been much more powerful than a human with the symbiote, which I'm going to separate out because obviously he becomes Venom, and then it's Harry and the symbiote become Venom, and I think that's a different thing, because that's them almost like totally in sync, totally vibing, and you get Venom. But I think earlier on he's a little bit OP, but I was fine with it. It's not really a criticism. It's just sort of an observation. But I like how they eased you in to it was almost like the symbiote had an arc, because at the beginning it wasn't really there. Then it was more of, then you saw it, then it became the suit, and they actually did quite a nice job with it. And then it had its own desires, which was, I suppose, was to like get onto Peter to help him, I assume, but also because it felt his power. And then maybe it was like, then it had a taste of power, and it was like, I don't want to give this up, which is almost like a weirdly unspoken silent arc running through the whole game.
I actually think you're spot on. Like, I think the arc of the symbiote in and of itself is one of the more, like, the better judged and well-paced elements of this entire plot, because it is really like the driving force between like for a lot of what happens. Because you've also got to remember that the symbiote's power and his ability to sense the symbiote's power is also a key factor for what drags Craven into the path of Peter and Miles. And then Craven getting involved is a massive part of what's his way of trying to goad Peter and the symbiote, when they are in unison, to be as strong and as powerful as they can be. But then that's drags out an equal and opposite reaction from Miles, who's of course still destined to get the Peter he knows from outside. And so all of these kind of different elements really play in unison, but it's all still driven fundamentally by the symbiote, which is Difficult to balance, I'd imagine, because it's a character that you can't give a voice without having him, be as part of another character, and you know where you need to end up. And I know that there's a lot of comic books and a lot of other media for them to look through and take inspiration from. But when you're talking about a piece of alien goo that has to end up being Venom, and it has to be someone inside of Venom you don't want to die, and so on and so forth, that's a lot to handle as a narrative team, I'm sure.
Yes, no, it must have been. I could have kind of come away. I think I'm going to disagree with you a little bit and say that I don't think they went hard enough with when Peter was black suit Spider-Man, or like symbiote suit Spider-Man. Like because you have like the sections obviously as you build up to it, and he's getting more cocky, more sassy, which I liked all of that. I felt like I wanted maybe a couple of real world missions where you were an out and out asshole, which you don't really get to have. You kind of, I'm trying to think. So you have the ones where you actually go against Kraven. Like Craven's guys, and you're obviously black suit Spider-Man, and you're messing them all up, and you like throw one of them through a window, and then you feel quite bad about it, which is like early on. You then have the ones later on, which is when you're trying to they're attacking you whilst you're trying to defend a particle accelerator, where you're a little, the sass is coming out a little bit more, and they do ramp it, like they do jack it up, don't get me wrong. I don't know, but I wanted go on, sorry.
I that's the thing. I think it's interesting that the words that you've used were arsehole and sass. And I actually think that's a really kind of sticky, almost like middle ground for the symbiote too. Because again, you're getting to the point that when that symbiote binds with Harry, you have to believe that he's all of a sudden going to double in size, going to grow fangs, and have an unrelenting appetite to bite people's heads off. If the last thing you see is, a Spider-Man 3 inspired scene where Peter goes to a hairdresser and gets an emo fringe or something like that, or starts pointing at ladies as he walks down the street. Like, you needed to have that. Exactly. There you go. Perfect. The double guns. I think you needed to have, we accept that there's an arsehole middle ground, but you also need to get to that point of losing control, which is why I think they needed to get to that point where they did get, where that one mission where Peter essentially goes to bed, wakes back up, and has no recollection of what he's doing as Venom, and it's the point at which he's actually chasing MJ down that tunnel, and wakes up the next day on a park bench, feeling better than ever, but no recollection of what he's done, or the fact that he was so distracted he let Miles actually get captured by Kraven. That transition was what was needed, and I don't know if another arsehole mission in between would have meant anything really to me. It probably would have just pissed me off more, but hey ho.
I think it's just before the thing for me was when you are then Miles and you fight Spider-Man. It seemed like the jump from him fighting, all out fighting Miles, and it felt like that jump was maybe slightly too much, because like you said, they did the trick where they said, "Oh no, Peter's asleep. He wasn't the one doing it," which totally makes sense. But then they almost, I kind of feel like they jumped to, he can't get the symbiote, he can't get rid of the symbiote. He would fight Miles to keep it, kind of thing. I don't know. I just didn't buy that at that point. But it's not like they're a million miles away. It was like, I just feel like it was.
Yeah.
Do you know what it is? I just wanted to be the dick for maybe 10 minutes and just do some.
He is a sufficiently big dick. He's getting calls from Rio Morales saying, "Hey, Miles is missing." He's basically go fuck yourself. Let's also not forget that he has a conversation with Harry where Harry asks for the symbiote back, and Peter tells him essentially to go fuck himself, which is an indirect way of saying, me being a better Spider-Man is more important than you being alive. That's pretty dickish.
No, it is. You're right. I suppose there's also when you play as Venom, which I'm torn on. I don't think it played very well. I think it felt sufficiently Venom-y. It obviously was a bit. Okay. He's a bit big and unwieldy in a game which is built to be fast and what's the word? I don't know. He can do Agile, yeah, agile. And then Venom is kind of not. Venom is a tank who just smashes through everything. He does have some agility too, of course, obviously he can leap around. But I don't know, I felt like, but I enjoyed that sequence. I enjoyed some of the voice play where they had the voice in your head and telling you to do stuff. I think I would have enjoyed some more of that as Peter as well. I think there was a couple of bits where I think, if I remember rightly, where you hear something, but I wanted it to be a bit more like, maybe not as hardcore as. Oh no, it does, doesn't it? Because it says kill them. It says kill Craven. It's going like kill Craven or something like that. Kill, and you kind of hear it. I wanted it a little bit more Senua. I wanted a little more
whispery.
Yeah, more and a bit more intense and a bit more freaky. They did do it, but I think I was like, are they going to go crank this right up? Yeah, like literally hear like Eddie Brock's, from Venom movie, like in the back behind your head going.
You took you took the words right out of my mouth. I've had a mid-recording revelation as I've been reminded that the man sat in front of me doesn't mind the Venom movies.
I didn't much like this and people think this is crazy. So I didn't particularly like the first one. There's some I think it's fun. I don't really like it when he becomes Venom. I just think the action stuff is kind of a bit but then I actually thought the second one was maybe better in tone. I thought they had more fun with it.
It definitely looked like they had more fun with it. I didn't watch the second one.
Oh right, okay. Yeah, no, I think people hated it, which is fair enough.
Now I'm starting to know why you wanted to see more of certain elements of Venom. I do agree with you, though, that like that sequence played like a sequence that only lasted for one level, i.e. it got given the exact amount of attention and polish that something that lasts as long as it lasts would have or should have.
Yeah.
Given all the other things that game is doing a lot. Like let's not, we talk a lot about the Spider-Man's combat abilities and traverse abilities and how they've been built on and enhanced for the sequel, but there are other like the Mary Jane sequences, the fact that they kind of I think we're trying to address some of the issues of like, hey, let's not go the insta-fail stealth route, let's do the kind of slightly more offensive stealth route, and I thought it just about worked. Like none of them outstayed their welcome. And
come on, really?
Genuinely,
she was.
You are like. Sorry, go for it. No, you go for it. Go for it.
Oh no, I was going to say like I didn't like the Mary Jane sequences that much in the first one, but I kind of saw why they were there. And when you had the interaction between her, I think it was one where she's in a train station and she's sneaking around and and then you can be Spider-Man as well, like taking people out for her. In this, where you are then when you're escaping with the meteorite or going in to get it, and you've got that jacked up taser with the webs on it, and you can take out like the symbiotes in like 3 hits. Do you know what it reminded me of? There's a sequence in the movie Doom, the movie with, I think it is not The Rock, is it? The Rock's not.
It is The Rock and Carl Urban.
Oh, it is it's The Rock. There's a sequence in that where they obviously wanted to like pay an homage to the game, and so the film switches to first person mode, and suddenly all of the demons who for the whole film have been sort of more like Alien, the film Aliens, where they are demons, where they kind of are in the shadows, they appear, they're really tough, you can't really get them. Suddenly they're just kind of like hanging out of a doorway going, "Arr," and then you just stand there and shoot with a machine gun. And then another one like drops out of a vent and doesn't come at you and just goes like, "Arr," and it felt like that. Like suddenly these fast, agile kind of OP enemies that Miles struggles to fight, they were like walking at MJ at like 1 mile an hour, just like rah, and she was, I don't know. I was like, I get why they've done it, because they didn't want the insta-fail stealth sections, that people didn't like them. How do you get around that? So I'm so torn, because I'm like, they needed to do something, and I see why they did what they did, but at the same time I was like, this is a bit too much. This is a bit stupid.
It definitely got a little bit stupid. I don't think it's quite as stupid. At least I didn't find it to be quite as stupid as I think it sounds like you did. Like, so
it was like that section. I think the other sections were
that they tuned but to suggest that they tuned the symbiotes to run at you at 1 mile an hour is disingenuous.
I'm using hyperbole to like make the point. I'm not saying they did. I'm saying that's how it felt in it. Suddenly they were like very easy to handle.
I just remember thinking that I was kind of at the back end of this game and we're hurtling towards a conclusion, and a lot of things were going on at once, and the idea of like trying to take this sort of 3-pronged approach to that mission where Miles and MJ and Peter all have something different to do was intriguing to me. And when I found out that that final sequence was where it was almost going to go full third-person shooter, and they were going to, maybe try and package up some of their Ratchet and Clank chops and funnel them into this, and I was like, okay, I'm down. And as soon as I felt, again, you're right about how ridiculous the stun gun is in a lot of ways, but as soon as I felt what it was like to shoot, then I was like, okay, I'm down for this. Speaking of Spider-Man, I think you got a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man of your own crawling from the.
There you go.
Little cameo.
And I know that they're in a difficult position, and I get that. And it's funny, you talk about that final section where you get to play as all three characters. So because people were saying, and I hadn't actually seen any of the reaction online, I just felt it when I was playing the game. I was like, blimey, they've really cranked MJ up. Like, she is a force to be reckoned with in this game. So I would say there's a period where she has the stun gun with the web attachment, where she can web hunters from a distance, which I was like, okay, yeah, this totally makes sense. Like, they've given her a means to be formidable against these human enemies that she can interact with from a distance. Like, don't get me started on the fact that she can sneak up on these apparent hunters who are like, who you shouldn't be able to sneak up on. That's fine. I get that. Like, that's just video game mechanics for you, right? You've got to be able to, you can't have it that she's, any noise you make, they're going to hear you. That would be so annoying. So I get why they toned down their ability in those sections, and the web gun worked really well. But yeah, so apparently they were going to leave MJ out of that final bit, and they weren't going to have her playable. But then they've said in order to make her playable in that section, because they thought they needed to, which I agree with. Like, I liked being able to actually physically go in, play as all three characters and do that. Yeah. One thing, but one of the, I can't remember who it was who went onto a podcast and talked about this, sort of what people have said about this, and specifically that last section where you get the meteorite as MJ. He said something. He said like they wanted MJ to feel like another hero, even though she doesn't have like powers. And I just think they didn't need to go like that hard. I think I would have maybe made more sense if they went a little bit back to stealth rather than be. But then I get what you're saying. Like, you liked the little power.
I had more fun with doing that than I did the stealth bits. And you're not going to sit me down in a Spider-Man video game and tell me that like a stun gun shouldn't be that strong, or that a woman should be able to take that many blows from a symbiote infected, from an alien infected. I'll be like, what are you?
Oh, she can't take any blows at all. Like, the one that I will say, if you try and go full throttle with her, she gets hit twice, she's done. Like, she's not like a combat character by any stretch. It was just, it's like when she gets given that weapon. Because the immediate reaction had to me was like, oh, give me that as Spider-Man. Like, let me use that to take out those symbiotes, because they can be really annoying. But anyway,
they can.
But this is obviously a minor part of it. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on the on MJ, because obviously that was a bit of a controversy in the first one as well, where people were all annoyed about the stealth sections with MJ. But I will say they did the best about the MJ parts, and not just MJ, but other characters in general, was the pacing. It gave you a minute to like change how the whole game felt, change the pacing, which worked really nicely, I thought.
Agreed. Yeah, no, they're nice buffers for certain.
Speaking about buffers, we mentioned it on the podcast, but obviously didn't want to give stuff away. The Haley section, where they switch it to her, you can't hear at all really, and she's walking around like looking at the spray paint. Who's done the spray painting? I thought that was really well done. Yeah, I thought it was well done, nicely judged. Again, like as you kind of introed it, a nice kind of change of pace. And also like I know some people get pissed off when they think that video games or video game developers are kind of like banging the drum, or like for some like political reason. But I personally never really kind of go into sequences like that with that kind of frame of mind. And I haven't kind of looked into what they did to ensure that sequence was authentic, for lack of a better word. But I like the idea that hopefully they spoke to someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, or use some kind of like first person account of like how people who are that way kind of see the world, or how they learn to like read an environment and so on and so forth. And using a video game as a way of kind of having an opportunity to get a window into that, I thought was smart and nicely handled, and adds a little bit more to
Haley's character as well, which was also welcome.
Yeah, no, totally. I thought it was very. I haven't seen anyone say it was like a political thing, and I can't imagine it was just a
people wrap it up with all the other, because obviously there's a mission where Miles helps I guess I presume homosexual students at the Drunken Visions Academy. Yeah, exactly, and inviting, and there are other kind of like allusions here and there to. I think we might have even discussed one once prior to recording, but like the inclusion of a potential trans character and stuff like that. And I think there are some people who sit around on the internet waiting for games like this to come out, waiting for characters or story threads or story beats like that to be included, and then weaponize them on social media for attention.
Definitely are.
Yeah.
So but apart from the Haley section and the Mary Jane section is like, whilst like I said, I was a little bit like the final MJ one, like all in all I thought they were great. I thought it all worked very well, and even like the sections where you're Peter or Miles outside of being Spider-Man, I thought those sections were like top notch. One of my favorites was where you get to walk around the fair. And you get to go on all the rides, and you get to play the games and stuff with obviously more character building with Harry and MJ.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's another one of those pacing moves that Insomniac are really great at. Like, it's not just the MJ sequences that break up the kind of the flow of how Spider-Man game is put together. It's even sequences like that Coney Island one where it's character building, but it's also an opportunity to kind of take the edge off of things and then very quickly ramp them back up. And I remember that, especially even if you include the back end of that mission. Obviously Craven's men come to kidnap, was it Tombstone? Yes. Who's working on the go-karts, and then that was the first time we see Peter like in a moment like unable to save lives, and he's struggling as the roller coasters go off the tracks, and it looks like he might have to let a carriage full of people go. And then we get our first glimpse at a new and improved Harry Osborn. All of those elements, all the way up to that reveal, that was a really strong mission, I thought.
Definitely. I think, like you said, that it's all the pacing is the way they implement that.
Wait, is that also the mission where Miles does the rhythm game in Mysterio's weird? When Miles becomes a DJ.
No. That's later on, isn't it? It's where when Miles goes to the first Mysterium or whatever they call them. That's not the same section, is it?
I thought that Miles goes into the Mysterium as part of the Coney Island visit, because Miles and Genki are at the fair at the same time as Peter and Harry and MJ.
I thought that was after. Oh, maybe you're right, actually, because he does say something.
And then Miles gets like spat out, and him and Genki like collect themselves, and then they bump into the other lot, and that's when Miles and Harry meet each other for the first time. Because otherwise, why is Miles there?
No, that does sound about right. I'm misremembering then. I don't remember those two bits happening together, but no, that would totally make sense. But no, like again, just such great pacing and such great use of something just like different. Because I played all the games. It was like you can play these games and then get a toy. I was like, I'm doing all of them. I did all of them. I got the toy. I did the whole thing. Because then it feels I don't know. You can tell the game when you want to just crack on, or whether you want to like do every little bit and to like make the most of it. And it definitely had me wanting to make the most of every little section like that, to sort of experience everything they had to offer, rather than just be like, no, I want to get through this, I want to get through that. But I think I was surprised at how much I liked Craven as a character, because I thought I was going to think that he was a kind of a means to an end character. Like he was there just to push the narrative of Venom along. But actually, I thought he was a great character, and I thought his missions around him and everything were very good. I thought he was going to become Venom as well.
Yes, there was a point in time where they had done the early things with the symbiote and Harry, where I thought, okay, well, we've seen what happens when Harry and the symbiote are married, and we've kind of crossed that possibility off the list now. And the other thing that I wasn't sure they were going to do was, how are they going to represent the physicality of Venom if anyone but Craven gets the symbiote? And I actually thought that was something that kind of worked, because if you'd asked me before the game came out who was going to be Venom, I might have said Harry. So the fact that they intentionally or otherwise, well, it might have just been a happy coincidence, kind of had Craven there almost ready to fill that spot. Especially as we discussed on the podcast a few weeks ago, when you see how late in the game, relatively speaking, some of these reveals happen.
Yeah.
Like you have a lot more Craven than I think people might have thought we would, but it all works because, and I remember saying this as well when we first discussed it, just a really strong screen presence and someone who is like willing to make. And again, I know I'm kind of sort of repeating myself from that podcast, but I can flesh it out a little bit by actually naming names now. But like, it's interesting to have a superhero property, a Marvel superhero property, no less, where like characters are going to die. Like we're just going to take people like Scorpion or Vulture, and it's like, no, they're fucking dead. And the reason they're dead is Kraven, which is why as well, to kind of jump around a little bit, I thought that whilst it was it was disappointing in some respects that Venom taking center stage meant that Kraven had to almost immediately step aside. I do think they kind of did him justice by having this big, the one time we see Times Square used as a kind of like a location for a narrative set piece, is like a fucking a nighttime fight between Venom and Kraven, literally to the death. Which also gives Venom a fantastic platform to, as I alluded to earlier, bite Kraven's fucking entire head off, which, again, in a game that sometimes skirts between the kind of like, hey, this is a T for teen game at the end of the day, like it's a very nice announcement of what Venom's all about, where it's like, yes, I'm healing the world, yes, I'm Harry Osborn, but also I will literally decapitate a motherfucker.
I think that was because the only sort of like gory bit in the whole game where they even have like he bites his head off. You do see some blood. You don't see it obviously, but I totally with you. I thought they handled that really well. And they even though like I said, I don't think you wouldn't want a whole game playing as Venom in that because it didn't feel like you. I think as you said, like it feels like a one level polish for that character, but it was totally enough to give you the power fantasy of being Venom fighting. Kraven, finally giving him what he was after, which was like a glorious death at the hands of like a predator that is worthy of taking his life, and it felt like it. This massive, epic tank with like giant teeth. I think it's where he like licks him as well, which when Venom does that, and you're just like, that is gross. But and he chops his tongue off, and then his tongue like immediately grows back, and then they like carry on.
Oh yeah. And it also like reaffirms the decision to give Venom as much screen time as he got, because he is such a force to be reckoned with that you can't. I don't know if you could take an enemy like Venom seriously if he was running around for 20 hours and you're constantly like just out of reach. Like Venom is a character who knows exactly what he wants, and there are very few things on the fucking planet that could stop him getting it, and those that do try will die. And so in that sense, he was around the perfect amount of time to always feel threatening.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's also,
at least for me.
No, I totally agree, because obviously a number of stuff they do after Venom arrives, and then especially after he gets the meteorite, and then the whole world changes, or you get Manhattan gets covered in those like tendrils of symbiote goo. Obviously, you still have an open world game with side quests, side missions that are now all affected by that. Like one thing I loved was you're just swinging around Manhattan, and people on the street are randomly turning into symbiotes, and then they're starting like trying to attack you, which I thought was brilliant. Like I wasn't expecting that level of world affliction from something that an enemy's doing actively in the game at the time. Like I don't think I've seen that in probably, I can't think of it in any like massive open world games like this. To that degree.
Not to that degree. Like there are, like the first Spider-Man game did have it did experiment with it, following the when all the prisoners get let off the raft, and all of a sudden there's like prisoners on rooftops and stuff like that. But when you see the way the symbiote literally and physically takes a hold of this city, it's like actually quite impressive. But I will say that I give them full credit for the execution on all of that. I don't know that I loved fighting symbioted humans for some reason. Which is weird because it may just have been as simple as the fact that like you, as that happened in Spider-Man 2018, like you've got to grips with your arsenal of abilities and how to take down different forms of enemies. and all of a sudden a new thing comes along, and it's like, I kind of know what this green one does, but sometimes I'm not 100% sure what the green one's doing. And yeah, we talked a little bit in the most recent podcast about potential tedium derived from the combat system, and I think the more punches an enemy takes to the head before they go down, the more you potentially lean into that tedium. But it was never overbearing. I just don't know that I loved it.
No, I do agree with you. Like it took me a while before I realized that if you just hit those green ones with like 2 web shots, that they're turned back into people. And I was so the second then I saw them, I was like web, and then they were all gone. But I think at first they were just annoying because I thought I was going to have to use up all my my finisher bars, like to just finish these things off at first, because they did seem quite tough. And then you get the extra, you get the concussion add-on for the you get the cluster mine thing for the concussion, which is and the sound to it, which helps. But actually, it doesn't help that much. You go through a whole string of stuff to like get this thing. It's going to be really useful, and you use it once, and then they sort of go for 10 seconds, and then they're back.
It's nice though that if you ever use it on a boss, like then I remember I already had the mine version when I was Miles fighting Symbiote Peter.
Right.
It's nice when it does the cluster thing. They set off one, and then as soon as they've worn off the effects, they run into another, and you're like, get in.
No, that is definitely, yeah. I was so grateful to have those when I was trying to finish off those symbiote areas where you have like the hearts, and you've got to destroy them and protect them from symbiotes for like a certain amount of time. And I think the first one I tried to do had 2 of those. I tried it twice and I couldn't do it. Like they were just rushing it. And then I think I upgraded to that, the mind thing, and then used that a couple of times. And that, to be fair, that was before I was even white suit Spider-Man. So I probably should have just waited a little bit longer before.
That was a fun reveal as well, actually. I wasn't really sure where that whole mission was going up to that point. Due to sort of like meanderingly kind of sending you over to the city hall because there are people stuck there and like something's going on here, but I don't know exactly what. And that was obviously the mission where you kind of get you get the full extent of your Martin Lee redemption arc, where him and Miles kind of go in to the Peter and the symbiote to kind of together to get to the root of their connection and like invert whatever elements of or traces of the symbiote are left within Peter. And by that point, again, for as much of a dickhead as he was, I'd completely bought into Martin Lee's sort of like turnaround and his character. I completely bought into, like, even up to the very end of that cutscene when they're like fighting off the last bits of symbiote. When Miles says something to the effect of like, when Miles refuses to forgive Martin Lee. Yeah. It's like, no, this isn't a guy who's just going to say, I forgive you for killing my dad. But he acknowledges like where the greater good lies and what a hero has to do. And that kind of stuff, as cheesy and comic booky as it can be, I thought was really strong and lent to like what we were talking about earlier about the strength of Miles's character. And then to get the anti-venom suit as a sort of a result of that whole process, and 4 new abilities as well on top of that, which I thought that was the other thing that, from a mechanical perspective, the fact that Venom has his own 4 abilities, and then Peter has like the abilities, and then the symbiote abilities, and then alternate versions of the symbiote abilities for some of the anti-venom abilities. I was like, okay, they've gone in hard on this, and fair play to them.
That was the answer to the question, because we were sort of saying like, what are they going to do? They're allowing you to pump skill points into these abilities, and then what are they just going to take them away? Are you going to get to play as Venom? And it was like, okay, you get to be anti-Venom Spider-Man and utilize those abilities, which I thought was great. It was a very good way of carrying that on. And they did tease you for a little bit before you obviously become anti-Venom Spider-Man. Like, you were like, oh, am I not going to be able to use those abilities anymore?
Yeah.
But you obviously touched on the end of the arc when he redeems himself. In general, what did you reckon to the arc from Lee and Miles? I think they did a very good job of like the angsty Miles not able to let Lee go, and then like you said, Lee sort of redeeming himself. I thought they played that quite well.
Yeah, like you have to buy a little bit into this idea that Miles Morales spent the whole of his spin-off game not really caring about Martin Lee. And all of a sudden seeing him being transported with a beard, like, brought up all these repressed memories and I guess even repressed anger to a certain extent. But once it got there, and it gave Miles his hook, then I thought it was pretty well judged. And certainly, like, I wasn't sure what Craven's intent was when he kidnapped Miles. At first, I thought it was just kind of a bait for Peter, like, hey, I've kidnapped Miles, come and get him. But when you realize he's got some weird gladiatorial setup and he's pitting you and Martin Lee against each other, I was like, oh, okay, this is really interesting. And yeah, that moment at the end of that fight where you're always sure, because it's Spider-Man, that Miles isn't going to kill Martin Lee in that case. But when he flings him up into the ceiling and lets him escape, just great Miles moments by way of, and I think that, that's, the testament to a strong villain or a strong anti-hero or whatever you kind of Martin Lee is now in your mind, is kind of what they bring out of and the responses they generate from within your primary heroes. And I think in that sense, like, Martin Lee is almost like the perfect foil to Miles throughout all of this.
It was a bit, I suppose, when you sort of think back to how Martin Lee is in the first game, it was quite, maybe he's had a little bit too much of a awakening to be a good guy, but at the same time, like, but you can kind of buy that. Like, it makes sense. He's gone to prison. He's realized the errors of his ways, and then he wants to sort of be a reformed character. But and I agree completely with you. I think they did it. They played it off well, really well. And then obviously that gives the impetus then him to turn Spider-Man, and it also takes him out of the equation in future because he hasn't got any powers seemingly now, because he's given them all to Peter to make him anti-Venom Spider-Man, which is a nice touch, to be fair.
He Uno reverse carded him.
He did, yeah. He'd absolutely used the Uno reverse card. Even though, like, I like the whole, like we said before. Oh, I forgot to mention actually. Because one thing that I think they did, which was cheeky with Craven, I think you mentioned it. Like, so he was big, he was super strong, which they even reference, like, how is he so big? How is he so strong? And it's like, this dude's going to become Venom. And then when they do the reveal about him having cancer and him basically about to die, I was like, this is pure Venom, because I'm like, the symbiote is going to go to him, it's going to heal him, that's how it's going to keep him alive. This all totally makes sense. And then when they they Uno reverse that as well and sort of go like, no, haha, it is Harry.
They needed to, because again, like, I hated that, like, I couldn't wrap my head around in Spider-Man 2018 that Peter is working for a scientist called Dr. Otto Octavius, and from the word go, everyone goes, well, he's Doc Ock, and then he starts developing these arms, and then these arms have a neural implant, and then that neural implant is messing up his personality, and he's becoming more, crazy and, like, unpredictable, and he's seeing Norman Osborn on the TV, and he's smashing the TV, and yet people still want to pretend that when Dr. Octopus scales up the side of that building, when the Sinister Six have all gathered around Spider-Man, that it's a reveal. It's not a reveal.
It's not a reveal at all. It was so obvious. No, you're so right. I hadn't even thought of it like that. So they actually did a really good job of being like, because we were questioning, up until like I think the last conversation we had before we'd finished it, we were both saying, I wonder who's going to become Venom, and we both were still questioning that. Which was...
I thought it would be. I genuinely fully switched over to thinking it would be Craven, and I was waiting during that sequence where Peter fights Craven and then Miles fights Peter. I was waiting for, like, the symbiote to get ripped off of Peter and to crawl over to Craven and to get our Venom reveal. And it turns out he gets put in a tube instead.
Yes.
And you have to go around doing a side mission with a tube on your back, because the game is like, I should probably see what's going on in the city. I was like, all right, I get it. You want me to do side shit?
With your little, with that big old tube on your back. Okay, let's talk about side characters for a bit. But before we do that, I just wanted to say, because I didn't mention it before, I was annoyed by MJ refusing to move in with Peter. I'm going to say this now before we move on, because then obviously it'll come back around again. But at the beginning of the game, where he's like, MJ, move in with me, and she's like, no thanks, I don't want to. I'm a journalist, I've got to be in this middle of the city, and he's like struggling to pay rent, and he's struggling to make ends meet. He's going to lose his house, and she's like, no thanks. And I was like, oh, you absolute stone cold bitch! I can't believe you've done this to us.
No. Jonesy, I hate to admit it, but the SuperShow stance officially on this matter is that we stan strong, independent women. And Peter can go fuck himself.
No, we don't. This is there's a split in the SuperShow opinion. We stand trad wives who want to stay at home and make pies.
Nope. I want the next spin-off game to be Spider-Man : Mary Jane Watson. and it's just about her.
I would love it if they did. If they did Spider-Man : Mary Jane Watson, I would absolutely love it. Just as just to try and piss people off and see what happened. I would think that would be one of the most hilarious things.
That would be a fun April Fool's tweet, like just a little, just so we can get 24 hours of internet reaction.
That would be so good, man. So
yeah. Plus, something tells me they've already got their own alternate plans for getting a female protagonist into the series later on, but we'll get to that.
Let's get to that in a bit because I wanted to talk about Cletus. So because you obviously made me think of it because you were saying that you were rolling around the city with the tube on your back. There is another tube, which we later find out is on board a train, which is the end of the flame missions. The flame missions did seem to come out a little bit sideways for me. They kind of seemed to come out of nowhere. I got it. Like they needed another faction. They needed something for Wraith to be tied up with. How did you not did you have this reaction? Wraith at the end of Spider-Man, when you finish all of those missions, the side detective ones, and you figure out that Yuri's been murdering people, straight up murdering people, and she gives you that phone call. And you're like, oh my goodness, she's a murderer. But I don't know where she is. When she came back as Wraith, I'm like, lock her up. Slap the handcuffs on, web her up, take her to prison. And you just apparently go, oh no, she's got a cool new suit and a mask. I'm going to let that slide.
Well, I guess, yeah, no, I do know what you mean. But fundamentally, I guess it's a reminder that Spider-Man isn't technically, he's not an official. He's not the law. He can put someone under citizen's arrest if he wanted to, but it's not really his vibe. And so I guess when you think about it, like it felt, don't get me wrong, I agree with you, and it did feel like they tried to walk back the serial killer stuff a little bit and to try and place her more firmly in vigilante territory.
Yeah.
So I think that's more palatable to some people nowadays. And the idea of Spider-Man having sort of some kind of a fragile alliance with a vigilante, like people wrap their heads around that a little bit better. Not everyone's a good guy in this world, but that doesn't mean they're all bad guys either. But at the same time, yes, it did feel like they maybe tried to get some separation between where Wraith ended up before and where she is now. Namely by I think trying to hone in on yes, still killing someone. She very much wants to kill Cletus or the Flame, but to save lives, which again, as we saw in practice, is a cause that Spider-Man ultimately can get behind.
Yes, and then of course, so yeah, we get to the end of that, and then we get the reveal in the train, which they wanted you to derail all along. You then have you get to one of the darkest moments of the whole game as well, which is you derail the train, the train then lands on top of you. You get covered in petrol, and then they set you on fire, which was interesting. Oh, obviously, I was scared over the fact that they also get the tube with the other symbiote, which is the red symbiote, which we then get the reveal about. Like Cletus Cassidy's gonna, set. I think he even says the line like, "There's gonna be carnage," and you're like, "Oh, this is gonna be sick."
He says that because you don't even know he's Cletus Cassidy at that point. I think you get a call after the fact. I can't remember who from. And that person who's on the other line lists off some of his known aliases, and one of them is Cletus Cassidy. But by the same token, yeah, when the Carnage line happens as he's clutching a red symbiote, it's not too hard to guess, I guess.
No, but and that's I'm up for that. Like that sounds sick. And we were sort of trying to figure out whether or not whether that'll be DLC, whether it'll be another game. I mean, it won't be DLC, but will it be like
it could be DLC.
I said it could be, but if anything, by looking at the first game, the DLCs were kind of not low rent or anything like that, but they kind of use them in here's a couple of more missions to do for a certain person. I'd be surprised if they went that angle. And here's Carnage. I don't know. I think it would maybe not be enough.
It's just hard to know like how much they value Carnage as a villain. Like I would not be surprised in any of the ways in which this tease went. The only thing that makes me uncertain as to them potentially keeping Carnage aside for a Spider-Man 3, for example, is they've already established a clear canon in which a symbiote being out and about is really fucking bad news.
Yeah.
Like, no matter where it goes or who it goes to and stuff like that. Like, get to the point where, as we've already discussed, by the end of this game, the entire city has been taken over by a symbiote, and people are turning into alien monsters. I think that having a symbiote out there in the wrong hands opens up a kettle of fish that I can see them wanting to keep, like, sectioned off. Maybe not in DLC, as you pointed out, because it probably requires maybe a little bit more heft than what we saw in the Spider-Man 2018 DLC. But a spin-off game where he's there, that would be
side
cool.
character in Spider-Man 3.
Maybe, but I also think it would kind of, I don't know, it would kind of suck if Carnage was a side character because he's so cool, but at the same time, I don't think you can do back-to-back symbiote bad guys.
I agree.
There's too many other things that we'll get to, I'm sure, very shortly, that the game wants to tee up that feel more appropriate for what might end up being like the closing arc of, Insomniac Spider-Man games.
Yeah, I think this is, it didn't, like we said, this is the end of a side quest. Whereas the other things they sort of touch on are all a sort of end of the main campaign and do definitely tee up for, like, this is what's going to be in the third game. We've got to mention just briefly maybe some of the cool little ways that they tied together sort of multiple Spider-Man properties. Like, for example, the end of the Spider-Bots mission where you collect all the Spider-Bots and then you go to an area where a portal opens in a wall and you sort of see through to the a bar in this sort of Enter the Spider-Verse style. And I didn't recognize the I've not seen the latest Enter the Spider-Verse, so apparently that's a character.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Okay.
But do you know how I know? One of my kids said, I can't remember the guy's name that they were talking about.
Miguel.
They were like, oh,
Yeah.
It's about Miguel hating that. And he was like, my kid was like, oh, that's from Into the Spider-Verse. And I was like, oh, I haven't seen it yet. But
it's worth seeing.
I really want to see it yet.
Miguel, without saying too much, Miguel is Spider-Man 2099, who is the character Oscar Isaac plays in the later Spider-Verse film. And I would spoil it, but he plays a very important, of all the Spider-Men that are in that movie, he plays a very important role in terms of his relationship with Miles and the way he sees the Spider-Verse and the collective responsibilities of Spider-Men and women around the world. Whether or not I want Insomniac's Spider-Men to kind of factor into that, like, I don't want Spider-Man 3 to be a full-on crossover between the two properties. For as much as I really, really like those movies, I just think that Insomniac have come far enough on their own to be able to see through their own story and without being beholden to, any other property or company or kind of timeline or whatever the fuck. But allusions to it and hints and cameos and Easter eggs, that's all gravy with me.
I would have loved to have been able to play as like an unlockable, because you can have the suits like that have the animated style on them, but it would have been cool to actually play in the world of that. I know that'd be completely like redesigning the world, so you couldn't just have it as an unlockable thing. But that would be seriously.
That sounds like making a whole new game.
It does, doesn't it? Maybe they could have done it with like one small area of one level.
You know what? I wouldn't be surprised if one person on the Insomniac team spent at least one day looking at ways they could like get some kind of a filter that they could be applied to the game through an options menu that achieved some of those results but still kind of worked, and they weren't happy with the results. If you told me that happened, I would believe you.
Right. Yeah. Like a couple of other side content touch on. So Flint Marko, Sandman, I kind of thought I played this totally wrong. I wish I'd have nailed all of these memory fragments like in the first 3 hours.
Oh.
I left them until I didn't think I'd finished the last one until probably just before I finished the whole main story. And it was like, and I'd already finished the entire Craven arc by then and was kind of like, I've done this entire thing just to hear about how he was getting almost captured by Craven and how he was worried for his daughter. And I don't know if I was a bit like, oh, okay, that was long.
I wasn't too bothered by that.
It was fine. It added something else. I got bored of fighting Sandmen, which is why I sort of stopped and just didn't do didn't finish all of those little.
They are pretty weak. By
They're
the way,
very weak.
fighting for Sandmen fully leveled up is not difficult.
No, they're like, and especially if you were in an area where there was a water source or an air source, you just pull them to you and they just all vaporize. And so I just, one of them, I just stood there, dragged all 20 of them into it and they just all turned to mush. And it was like, oh, that was easy. But do you know what? It was still a night, like having Sandman at the beginning was wicked. Like that whole early fight is to like get you into the game and introduce Peter as, you know, the substitute teacher and everything, with Miles in the class. I loved all of that. I thought it was great. Chameleon, that was a cool little sort of side thing.
Not a character I know a huge amount about, so not a character I can get too excited in terms of like the kind of tricks that they might have up their sleeve, but certainly the idea of someone who can take the form or the shape of anyone, who, you know, now through his connections to Craven and his presence in the city has perhaps a reason to be slightly more involved in the lives of our Spider-Man. I could see that playing out interestingly in another form of like side missions in Spider-Man 3, but I doubt it's much more than that.
Yeah. No, it was a nice little sort of, I love, whenever I think about a game and side characters and ways of introducing them, I always go back to like the Arkham Asylum and how they had, you know, the cells and you could go into it and you're like, holy shit, this is the cell of this person and you can see all this stuff and it was paraphernalia, and I just loved all those little tidbits, and they didn't even have to be part of the story, you could just happen upon them. And so the way they did inject some of that into the game, where they had just like little stuff like, you know, you find all that, you go into Chameleon's house and you have a little experience. I'm like, that was so cool. We haven't talked about her, but like Black Cat and how they introduce her just for a little fun section, and then she uses the magic staff to disappear.
Right, which also gets us our Doctor Strange reference.
Absolutely. Obviously. Yeah, exactly. Which then just tie all these little ways of tying these characters together, I think is so much fun. And I love that they did it. I love that they kept all that up. But let's wrap this up, I reckon, by finishing off talking about what happens at the end of the story with Venom, and then we can touch on some of the post-credit reveals and what they might mean for the future. So I think, talking main story, where we pretty much got up to fighting Venom. Venom's killed Craven, and then Venom has taken over the entire city. He's extended the tendrils of the symbiote through the meteorite. Mary Jane does her little bit where she goes in, steals the meteorite back, and then you have the epic fight with Venom where he grows wings. And straight up, I'm like, is he inspired, or did he inspire, or the vice versa? Like Spawn, like who wrote Spawn and did Spawn come first? But yeah,
good question.
It was. I thought that whole bit was wicked. Like I loved that craziness.
The wings were very cool. The only thing the wings did for me was there was a moment, and this is all my fault, and I'm not going to blame the game on it, where I was like, oh my god, they've given him wings because Venom is going to become open world playable, and that's his web wing alternative. He can already kind of swing with tendrils, and now he's got wings as well. So he's going to become open world playable, when in fact, you just kill him.
Yes.
But the wings are a great reveal and make him look twice as imposing, which is cool.
They do, and it gives you that ability then to he obviously, you get the verticality in there, you get the fact he like flies off into the atmosphere with you, and you like get to fight him as Spider-Man and Miles. I thought all of that was visually stunning, very cool. The you wrestling with the Harry, we can do this, and all that I thought was fantastic, and loved all of that. And then you get to the little heart-wrenching moment where you kill, because he straight up, like Peter does, doesn't he? Peter kills him by using his anti-venom power.
Yeah, and then Miles resuscitates him with essentially his God-given defibrillator.
Yes. I will say, not so much with the Venom stuff, because I think they did a nice job of like moving around the locations. So the fights with and switching characters as well, because you fight Venom obviously as Peter Parker, you fight him as Miles. I was getting a little bit like, with the traditional sort of, you've got rid of one of their health bars. Oh look, they've got another health bar.
Yeah,
because this happens with the lizard. Yeah. Lizard, it happens with. It happens.
For me, it was when MJ becomes Scream momentarily, basically for the center of one boss fight, and there was at least one too many stages for that, for my liking. but Lizard as well. Because it's almost like the boss fights were improved over previous games, but sometimes they didn't change that much between phases.
No.
And sometimes they were also extremely hard by the final phase, which also made things a little bit trickier as well. Like, it's a game that wasn't afraid to kind of like ramp up the difficulty, even on the default, for some of the boss fights. Usually all my fault because I panicked and was spamming dodge when I know that I should actually be waiting to see what color my spidey senses are and parrying. And it's like, no, I dodged when I should have parried. I deserve that.
I got caught.
A lot.
I definitely got caught by the old, is this a dodge, a smash attack, a parry attack, or I can't remember which boss it was, but I completely messed it up like 5 times on the trot and died like 3 times fighting the same boss because I just kept getting smashed. That I thought was I was like, oh, that's a dodge. No, but then I thought like the Venom I thought actually in comparison was quite straightforward and relatively simple. Like, it didn't seem anywhere near as tricky as like even mine. Lee got me a couple of times with his horizontal versus his vertical negative energy slices, which was a little bit annoying.
I got the hang of them fairly quickly, but I agree with you. Venom wasn't too bad.
Scream was really annoying.
I just remember Scream lasting too long. I found Craven quite annoying at one point. Again, I just kept reading him wrong.
Oh yeah, no, I did with Craven. Yeah, when he was the way you're fighting him in the little arena and you're trying to
like that first fight when you're Peter and you've just arrived. Yeah.
Yes, but in the end, like you said, you do you kill Harry, which then vaporizes the symbiote, because there's a section where it's crawling away and I thought it was going to like get away, or I thought you were going to, and then it just kind of turns to dust and I was like, oh okay, no, it's dead. But then when that dies and everything's gone and the meteorite's blown up and you sort of finish everything out, and then, which was a little weird, was you still have the symbiote turned people knocking around, but kind of makes sense when you consider the Carnage angle and the fact that there are still symbiotes about, I suppose, maybe.
Well, there's also just like there are side missions devoted to those types of characters and those nests, and like there are some elements of open world game design where if you're going to let people free roam afterwards and get a platinum, which Insomniac do want to do, Insomniac have now gone 3 for 3 on the most attainable platinums of recent memory.
I thought this was a little too attainable.
I don't think there's such a thing.
It felt like just through happenstance I'd done 98% of what they wanted me to do for the platinum, and it took me like an hour to just put a bow on it. Whereas I just kind of, I don't know. But no, to be fair, actually, that's me doing all that stuff during the game.
Yeah.
To be fair, yeah.
And fundamentally, you're being rewarded for doing 100% of the game, and that's the way it should be for me. I understand that, like, having some grind, but there are going to be plenty of people who didn't find, and I can tell you because I'm one of them, nearly as many like spider bots, for example, as you did during your time. So I had about 5 or 6 hours of cleanup on my end when I finished the story. That's
fair. You don't want to be you don't want to giving people like 15 hours worth of cleanup to do at the end of a story. That would just be infuriating if they put too much stuff into the back end.
For sure. And like, we still live in an age of missable trophies, and like, oh, you have to start a new game because there's no other way to get that collectible. Like, oh, great.
That is so, when that happens is I just don't.
It's more common than you think.
So okay, let's finish this out then. So end of the story. One of the most surprising things to me, given the fact that everyone's anticipating a third entry in this series, Peter Parker says, I'm going to be Peter Parker for a while, and kind of suggests that he's hanging up the Spider-Man costume. Despite and to be fair, I like the fact they did this without having to say, you can go back to a save just before that. They just said, no, you can just play as Spider-Man through the city. Don't worry about it. Like, crack on. Because they could have done that thing of trying to keep the narrative going and be like, well, he's hung up his spider suit. How can he be Spider-Man? They didn't bother. They're just like, go for it. You can play as Spider-Man. Yeah. So yeah, well, I was surprised about that because I was then thinking to myself, does that mean he's not going to be Spider-Man for Spider-Man 3?
Well, I mean, so I guess I'd be very surprised if they got rid of Peter as Spider-Man whole hog. I think, though, that it opens up an opportunity for him to take a back seat as a Spider-Man, perhaps. And obviously, the more of a back seat he takes, the more of a grand, dramatic reveal he can be. And I can totally foresee a situation where an hour, 2 hours into the next game or the final game, Peter steps aside for good, only to be dragged back in one last time, like having that dramatic conversation with Mary Jane, excuse me, where he's like, I have to do this for Miles, and it's like the big reveal of like Peter comes back with a new suit that you've never seen before after not being Spider-Man for the whole game. Like, they're gonna do some of that shit. And obviously I don't know if we're gonna go straight to post-credit sequences, but they do
take us there.
Well, so there are a few different post-credit sequences, but one of my actual favorite ones, not because I knew who the character was, but because I thought it was a slight bait and switch, happens when Miles finally meets his mum, Rio's new boyfriend, who, the second that a boyfriend is teased and mentioned, and Miles has to leave the house just before he comes around for dinner, it's about a third of the way through the game, I was like, that dude's someone important. But I was racking my brain for middle-aged single men in that series, for like who's going to walk through the door in a post-credit sequence, and Rio's going to be like, Miles, meet my boyfriend, and it's like, oh my god, it's Norman Osborn, but obviously, but the clever thing they do is that it's actually nothing to do with the boyfriend, who is a guy called Albert Moon. It's his daughter Cindy Moon, who was a character who was introduced, I think, in around 2014 in the comics, so a relatively new character. But she is also known as Silk, and essentially she is a Spider-Woman in the same way that Peter and Miles are Spider-Men, to the point where she is also, her ability is also derived from being bitten by a radioactive spider. So we essentially just have a young Asian-American Spider-Woman on our hands, depending on how quickly they roll her out, if at all.
Mate, if they put her as a Spider-Woman in Spider-Man 3... it will be the worst thing. No, I'm joking. Of course I'm joking. Like, that sounds... I think it sounds sick. I love origin stories, and if you can get a bit of origin story and a new character, and often with the female characters, obviously, because they don't like to go like brute strength route, they go for like super agile, super fast. The idea of having like a character that is even faster, more agile than Miles, because I think they did a really nice job of weighting, Miles to Peter feels like a more fluid character, but a little bit more gangly, a little bit more like a teen who's finding himself, but feels very fluid and very acrobatic. If the idea that they could maybe even ramp that up, I think is a really good direction to go in. And especially if like we said, if they do a thing where it's sort of like Spider-Man maybe isn't in it at the beginning, we've now had 2. We're going to want 2 at least next time. So how do you do that? Introduce a new character. Absolutely.
For sure. And I only know this from Wikipedia. I have no real like knowledge of the character myself, but like she's described as being faster than Peter Parker, but not as strong, but also having a much stronger spider sense than Peter has, or a silk sense. That she, as it's called.
I don't like that. Silk sense.
Also, according to Wikipedia, that she shoots her webs out of her fingertips as well, which is another weird. Which I guess.
I thought you then were just going to say out of her ass, which I was going to say that'd be interesting.
I'd love to see the animations that they do for that. She does a double backflip and then just farts out some rope.
She shoots out of her fingers. That's so. But in this,
that's what Wikipedia says.
Because no, I'm trying to think, because of course in this one it's technological. It's not like Tobey Maguire Spider-Man where it's like biological, which some people hate, right? So she just made tech where it shoots out of her thing. Okay, yeah, no, that's cool. Yeah, no, that sounds wicked.
Unless they're going to do their own version of her though, right? So we'll see.
That's true. Do you reckon they do Spider-Man Silk like they did Spider-Man Miles Morales?
Well, it's difficult because we knew more about put it this way, like Miles as Spider-Man appeared at the end of Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And like Cindy Moon, I think, let me get this right. She's like 14 or something like that. And so whether or not she's ready to be Spider-Man, how quickly or easily she introduces herself as like, I think there is a little bit more ground to cover.
Own game.
But it's interesting. We'll see. Very possibly. But then at the same time, if you believe the designers and so on, in terms of what they've said on podcasts and on social media, they want the fans to kind of to steer or direct where the franchise goes in the future. But they know what they're doing. They know the power and the weight that post-credit sequences hold in this day and age, especially when it comes to superhero properties. And they know that you don't name drop someone unless that's important. And everything they've name dropped thus far or teased thus far from, you know, from as we mentioned, from Miles' transition into Spider-Man all the way through Harry being alive and suspended with by the symbiote. Obviously, they've teased someone becoming the Green Goblin twice now. So they're not teasing it for nothing. But with Silk, that's the biggest mystery to me. The other ones, Green Goblin, other than who it's going to be, that's obvious for me, unless it's a bait and switch. But I don't think it will be.
Yeah, the other post-credit sequence was where Norman Osborn is really pissed because he blames the Spider-Man for killing, or for Harry, you know, getting really ill. And he sort of screams at them and says it's their fault. Then he smashes up his hospital room as they both leave, if I remember rightly. And then we see Norman Osborn go and find Doc Ock and say that he wants revenge on the Spider-Man.
Yes.
And I think by that point, he's already called someone and said, get the G serum or whatever it is, which is...
The prepare the G serum happens just as Harry's being loaded onto the ambulance outside the EMF Foundation.
So we're at the point where it's like, is Norman going to be Goblin? Is Harry going to be Goblin? We're obviously assuming it's going to be Norman, but then obviously how does Doc Ock play into that? Does Doc Ock get released from prison and then play a part where he then goes after Spider-Man or Peter, because he knows obviously Peter Parker's Spider-Man, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And then how does that roll out into a third game? And how do they play with all of that? Sure. Which is going to be...
I'm curious to see. I looked it up, by the way, and because I wasn't sure myself. And it turns out basically either Harry or Norman could become the Green Goblin, like they both have been in the past. Norman is considered the primary Green Goblin. And traditionally, in most stories thus far, with the exception, I think, of the Amazing Spider-Man films, Harry becomes the second Green Goblin after Norman has become the Green Goblin and died.
Yeah.
So like, do they go traditional with that arc where Norman does something, falls foul of the Spider-Men, and Harry then becomes motivated to become the Green Goblin? I don't know. They could just skip straight to Harry, but I have a really hard time imagining a Harry consistent with the one that we know, waking up from that coma and being like, well, I have to kill Peter now.
It wouldn't make any sense, would it?
It wouldn't make sense. Which is why I'm leaning towards Norman. They have presented Norman as what feels like slightly older than perhaps you'd imagine the Green Goblin being, but obviously between suits and serums, a lot can happen.
Yes.
And obviously they do dramatically ramp up just how angry Norman is by the end of the game. He spends a lot of that game being a slightly sympathetic almost character compared to how he's presented in Spider-Man 2018. And then all of a sudden, in spite of the fact that essentially the symbiote being the symbiote is his fault and that Harry is given back to him, hey, let's bottom line, alive, he still decides to absolutely lose the plot and fucking smash up a window. So... I don't know. I thought that transition from sad Norman to angry Norman was one of the less well judged transitions, and I think more often than not, in a narrative sense, when you have a transition that isn't as well handled or feels rushed, it's because a writer really needs a character to get to a certain place very quickly and doesn't have the time or the space they need to justify it, so it just happens. And I wouldn't be surprised, therefore, if that thread was picked up on in future entries.
No, I think I agree with you. Like it would make much more sense if it's Norman, and it makes more sense against the wider Spider-Man stories out there, and with Pete and with Harry. Like, I don't know. It just doesn't really make that much sense. It makes, I suppose you could argue the fact that the G serum turns you insane, and so he's going to get crazy. And then you have a weird thing where he could do the whole MJ stuff where he maybe kidnaps MJ, which forces Peter out of retirement as Spider. But I mean, there's so many places they could go with it. I mean, it almost seems ridiculous to postulate too much at this point. Yeah. But Jamie, I think pretty much we've spoiled the entirety of Spider-Man 2.
We have everything
we intended to do.
Yeah. Everything that people on YouTube who make scummy, spoilery thumbnails were intent on doing the second the game came out, we saved a normal amount of time and then delivered in the form of a spoiler cast. And for that, Jonesy, I feel like we've served our community well.
I agree.
Like true Spider-Man.
Yes. Well, whoever's watched this, our Patreons, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope we didn't spoil too much. No, we did. We spoiled everything. That was what we were intending to. I hope you enjoyed us spoiling it for you. If you played it, if you haven't. But that's it. That's all we're talking about today.
What's we gonna spoil next? You're not gonna finish Alan Wake anytime soon. You're not even start it.
Oh no, I don't even think I could spoil it if I tried. I don't think I'd understand it enough to spoil it.
Folks, you've been waiting, and now the time has come. We're gonna spoil Marvel's Avengers.
Yeah, we'll spoil Marvel. Tell you what we'll do first. We'll play Marvel's Avengers on stream so people can enjoy that a little bit before it is disappeared to obscurity forevermore. But thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment down below if you enjoyed this, and hopefully we'll do some more Patreon exclusive content soon, and other content, all content, everything. We're going to do the Jim. We've got to do the Jim Carrey thing at some point in the near future. We've got to watch Jim Carrey films, which will be good.
That's as far as homework goes. It gets a lot worse.
It does. But yeah, no. Cheers. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Bye.
Bye.